Today's date is August 8th, 1996. Today we're speaking with Mrs. Cila Drucker, whose maiden name is Bernstein. My name is Mark Mitkowitz. The interview is taking place in Toronto, Canada, and we're speaking English. Could you tell me your name, your current name, please?
My name is Cila Drucker.
Could you spell that, please?
Cila Drucker.
And your maiden name?
Bernstein. Bernstein.
Did you ever have any other last names?
No, I did. Oh, yes, I did. Sorry. During the war, I had a Czech name, Teresa Bednarova.
Could you spell that, please?
Tereza Bednarova.
And what about a Yiddish name or first name?
My Yiddish name is Zisel Zine.
How would you spell that in English?
Well, very hard. Z-I-S-L-E-C or S-I-N. No, Zine is C-I-N-A, I suppose. It's phonetic.
Where were you born?
I was born really in Radomyśl Wielki, a small town in Poland. But after the war, when I applied for a passport, I stated my city of birth as Mielec, as I knew that I'll never go back to Poland, and Radomyśl Wielki seemed too complicated a name to spell.
What was the date of your birth?
April 6, 1928.
So how old are you now?
I'm 68.
What was your father's name?
David Bernstein, or sometimes David Kurz Bernstein.
How do you spell Kurz?
K-U-R-Z.
And your mother's name?
Erna Esther. Her maiden name was Grün.
And how was that spelled?
G-R-U with two dots, like a U umlaut N.
And any brothers or sisters?
I had one sister. Her name was Chania. C-H-A-N-I-A.
Going back to the beginning, before perhaps your earliest memory, what would be your earliest memory of your childhood?
My earliest memory is from the time when I was maybe 5. We lived in a house a bit on the outskirts of town, and one day we came home and we realized we were robbed, and my father decided to move into the city, and there was a building, a modern, so-called for that time, apartment building being built, and he rented a flat. And I remember going to the building whilst it was constructed, walking up planks and looking around. And when it was finished, we moved in to the upper flat. There was another flat on the same floor, which was occupied by a Jewish doctor, Dr. Kaufman. The landlord lived downstairs, and there was a law office downstairs.
Did you think there was any Jewish aspects to the robbery, or do you think it was random?
No, it was just random. Some of the things we still found in a sheet on the bed, which we probably surprised the robbers, and they fled.
What did your father do for a living?
He represented the flour mill, and he also did bookkeeping and balances for some businesses, Jewish businesses.
What kind of home was it? Maybe describe both the wealth, and then we'll talk about.
Well, we probably did well because we had a maid. We also had a telephone, number 28, which was not very usual for those times. We used to go for holidays to a town called Krynica, which is a spa in Poland on the Slovak border. We were very nicely dressed. We used to get a dressmaker twice a year that came to the house and did our clothes, my sister's and mine. My mother made her clothes in a town called Tarnów, because the dressmaker wasn't probably good enough for her. And I never felt any deprivation or problems, financial or nothing of that kind. And that's probably why we didn't emigrate, because we had a good life.
Was your father involved in any kinds of Jewish groups, any kind of...
Yes, he was a great Zionist. He actually wanted to move to Palestine before the war. And as far as I remember, he wanted to go by himself and find a job and some accommodation so my mother shouldn't suffer. And my mother said, no, if we go, we all go together. And between their disagreements, we never went.
And what did he actually do for...
He was a leader of an organization called Akiva. And he spoke fluent Hebrew. He taught the young people that went on Hachshara to Israel, to Palestine. He taught them Hebrew. He was extremely popular in the town with the young people. We always had some young men and women in our house. Whenever there was a Zionist meeting in the city, we had people from Krakow, from Townroom. I remember even a small anecdote that once there was some representative in the house and we had dinner and he was eating and talking and I piped up, when you eat, you don't talk. So of course I was scolded. But young people always came to the house and sort of babysat with me. It was an honor to take me for a walk or my sister later on because they just liked him very much. He was very, very popular in that he was very clever. He was self-taught. He went to Cheder and then to yeshiva till he was, I think, 16. But he found it too confining as far as knowledge was concerned. He wasn't allowed to learn Polish or Hebrew, so he left. He took off his payas and his bekeshi, his long coat, and he became so-called modern. Taught himself Hebrew and Polish, German, eventually English, French, Esperanto, Arabic. I mean, he didn't speak all those languages perfectly, but he had a knowledge of many of them.
What language did you speak at home?
They spoke Polish to us and Yiddish between themselves, so we don't understand. But eventually we understood, because I remember my mother once saying to somebody when they came to the house and started speaking Yiddish, she said, "Ma'avon kol diber," which when I knew Hebrew, I realized that it means "Mevina kol hadibur," that means she understands everything.
Why do you think they spoke Polish to you?
I don't really know. They also sent me to Polish school, to a mixed school with, I suppose my father being modern, he wanted me to integrate into the Polish society and feel comfortable in the country I was supposed to live. And I did have a teacher that came to the house and taught me English and Hebrew. Why he didn't teach me Hebrew, I asked him once. You taught so many other people Hebrew, why weren't you my teacher? So he explained that, first of all, it's hard to teach your own child. Second of all, the teacher that taught me Hebrew was poor and he needed a job. And if people in the city will realize that David Bernstein lets his daughter be taught by this person, then they will give him their children also. And this way the man can make a living.
Tell me about your mother.
My mother was an only child. Her father died before she was married. She, I think, was an extremely clever and intelligent lady who spoke Yiddish and Polish very well. She also took English lessons with me when my turn came to have the teacher. She was an excellent housekeeper, an excellent baker and cook, and she dressed beautifully. I think she was the best dressed woman in town. I can still describe her clothes.
Why don't you tell me one that comes to your mind?
What
she looked like the way she carried herself.
She carries herself very well, very elegant, even though she wasn't tall. I have a picture of her in the city where you can see mud on the street, but she was wearing lizard shoes, high heels, with a black coat and a fair collar, a fair hat, and a fair muff. We were always dressed in white from top to bottom, to the point where we couldn't even play well because we would get dirty. She was kind. She used to send some jam on some compote that she used to make herself to people that were sick in the city and visit people that weren't well. She used to play in an amateur Jewish theater. I just read about it in the book about Mielec that I have. Her name wasn't mentioned, it's just in general that we did have a Jewish theater. So I was glad that I remembered right, because sometimes you don't know where fantasy starts and real memory begins.
And what kind of background was she from?
She was from a small town, born in Radomish Wielki. Her father was supposedly also a very clever man who was the head of the Jewish community. They had fields and forests when she was little, but as my grandfather was sick for quite many years, he had a kidney infection. So they kept selling off the property, and when he died, my grandmother opened a grocery store, which she was running all by herself. I loved to go visit her and play storekeeper, and she let me take the money and put it in the drawer. There were no cash register at that time, give change, and the smell of the store was just magnificent with all the spices. Everything was in sacks, not packaged like today.
What was her name?
Her name was Freindl Green. I don't know her maiden name. She was also a bit superstitious, because when I used to visit her dressed beautifully, she would take me, show me off to all the neighbors and relatives, and then I would come back and have a headache from all the attention. So she would put a red bundle on my wrist to ward off the evil eye and do some voodoo with some coal. She would make the coal hot, then sprinkle with the water, and she would dip her fingers in the ashes and try to put it over my forehead, which of course I never let her because I was scared. And she would chase me around the house. I don't know if she ever caught me.
What was religious life like in your home?
My grandmother on my mother's side was very religious, so was my grandfather on my father's side. My grandmother wore a sheitel, my grandfather wore a strammel Saturday and a long black coat. As I said, my father was not that religious anymore, but my mother made sure that the house was kosher, and he made Kiddush every Friday night, and we went to shul. I don't remember Saturdays, but definitely Yom Tov we went to shul where the women were upstairs and the men were downstairs. I think we only had one real shul. They called it the shul, but there were many shtiblers, and where very, very religious people prayed.
And what town was this where you were living in when you were growing up?
Well, that was 28 to 39.
And this is Mielec?
Mielec.
And what was the town like? How large was it?
I always thought that it was 3,000 Jews, but in the book I just read that there were 15,000 people and 5,600 Jews.
So what was life like for the Jews when you were growing up there?
Well, there must have been some anti-Semitism, because just thinking back, I remember that when I was walking on the street, some boys would call me Żydówka, which means Jew. And towards 37, 38, when my father would go to a meeting and would come back home late at night, my mother would look out the bedroom window, which faced the front, where the main entrance was to the building, to make sure that he wasn't attacked from the back when he tried to open the front door. But otherwise, it was a cultural city. There were a lot of professionals, Jewish professionals. My parents' friends were lawyers and judges and dentists and doctors. And as I said, there was the theater, there was a gymnasium, a high school, and I think the Jewish people had quite a good life. I'm sure there were many that were very poor, but and they would come to the house for to beg, and my mother would always give them money, except she would get upset sometimes. We had two entrances, front and back. The husband would come to the front and the wife would go to the back, which happened quite often. But otherwise, I think people had quite a good life, the ones that, of course, could afford it.
Tell me about your sister.
My sister was born in 1934. She was 6 years younger. She was very beautiful, to the point where when the war broke out and the German soldiers were walking down the street, they would stop her, pick her up, and give her candy. She had curly black hair, olive skin, beautiful black eyes. Her eye whites were blue. She was really stunning. I think they used to say that she was the beauty, I was the brains, but I think that's what they said. And she was 5 years old when the war broke out. I was very jealous of her because for 6 years I was the queen. I reigned over our household, my grandfather's, my grandmother's. I was the first grandchild to my grandmother on my mother's side. And then all of a sudden this interloper arrived, and whoever came to the house took a bee line for the crib, and I was ignored. No psychology at that time to remember that there is another child to pay attention to. And I was quite jealous. Later on, when she was bigger, we had fights and pinching and kicking, as usually in the family. And then I would have to take her with me when I went to play with my friends. Take her with you when you are bigger and smarter and older. You should know better, this kind of things. But later on, I would give, I don't know what, to have her with me.
What's your first memory that things started to get worse for the Jews?
Well, when the war broke out, we were at home, and a little while after the war broke out, we tried to run away to go east. My parents rented a truck for the things and a car for us, and we were driving east towards the Russian border. We got to a city where either my mother or my father had an aunt, I don't remember which side she was on, quite close to the river Buk or San, where the Germans eventually stopped on this side of the river and the Russians came to the other side. And whilst we were resting in that city, the Polish radio made an announcement to all the young men of military age, married or single, to run away because the Germans would conscript them into the German army to fight the Poles. So my father and my uncle, who was with us, my uncle Ian Jochciu, and any young man that was at that time in the household, left. They crossed the river and they went to Lvov, Lemberg. And my mother and I eventually, and my sister, took the truck and the car and we went back home. I suppose nobody knew the extent of the damage that the war would cause to the Jews, and she didn't feel like leaving her possessions and just crossing the river with the two children with nothing, which was a big mistake because my father survived and my mother didn't. And then when we came home, I remember my mother burning everything that had anything to do with Palestine, because they had those certificates that people used to buy, or the blue boxes, the Keren Kayemet, anything that had to do with Jewishness, they would burn that. And there was nothing to eat. Then they would collect all the jewelry and iron and steel and whatever for the war efforts. But We sort of lived a kind of a normal life for a while, except that we didn't hear from my father for a long time. And my mother was, I think, very close to a nervous breakdown because she was worried that something happened to him and he perished or was killed. Till we got the first news that he is all right. She decided not to touch the money that my father left because she didn't know how long the war will last. And she started baking professionally for a small cafe that the Polish woman opened. This Polish woman used to live in Poznań, and when the Germans took Poznań because they decreed that it used to be German and they want it back, so they annexed it to Germany and they threw out most of the Poles. So she came to Mielec, she opened a little cafe, and my mother would bake. And she would get up 5 o'clock in the morning and I would help her. I would have to carry sometimes the trays to the baker, and I was very ashamed, humiliated that I had to carry trays of cookies across the town to the baker. But this is how she supported us for the remaining years of the war.
Just going back on a couple of things. When you ran away the first time, do you remember the name of the aunt whom you ran away to? Do you remember when you rented the truck and you ran?
No, I don't remember.
And when was it that your father ran away, or when?
Well, it was in sometime in 1939.
Do you remember what month it would have been?
No.
And how long is it until you heard from him again?
6 years. I heard from him again 1945, and I saw him, I think, end of 45 or 46 when he came back.
And did your mother ever have contact? You said to hear that.
Yes, they wrote to each other, and as a matter of fact, I have one card that she wrote to him in Russia, and he must have kept it and brought it back, and I have it. I treasure it.
And do you remember the name of the woman who was involved in the bakery?
No. So I told you before, I have very selective memory. There are many things that I don't remember at all, including the Polish language. It's not that I don't remember it at all. It's just I don't understand how, speaking Polish for 15 years, I cannot really express myself well. Where later on I learned Czech, and I spoke it only for 2 or 3 years, and I speak it very well. So there must be some hidden message there about things that I don't want to remember. Also, I should maybe mention that when the Germans did walk in and occupy Poland, they took one room. They decided that our apartment was too big for just my mother and the two of us. So they gave us a tenant, a German engineer who was working in a factory. We had a factory producing planes in the outskirts of the city, and he was working there. And also because of that factory, when the war broke out, we were immediately bombed because they wanted to destroy that factory whilst the war was still going on. So we had this German man living with us. Seemed to be quite decent as Germans go. He used to let us buy food in the stores that were exclusively for German soldiers or civilians. He let me go there with his card. And this is maybe why my mother was able to bake, because this is what I now think. I don't really remember it. I just think that was the reason that she could do it, because he allowed her to buy flour and eggs and sugar in the stores.
How did your mother explain to you what was going on?
I don't remember her explaining to me anything. I just know that our house became a center point for many of the women whose husbands ran away the way my father did. And they would come to our house in the evening and talk and exchange news and compare notes and share the letters, the literature. and maybe also eat some of the cookies that my mother had left over. Some of them knew about their husbands, some of them didn't. There was a lot of crying and lamenting. But I don't think she ever sat down and said to me, look, this is what's going on, and maybe she just wanted to shield us. Because we somehow were allowed to stay in our home till 1943, even though we weren't allowed to use the front door, because the apartment house where we lived was on the main street, Piłsudski number 19, and the Jews were not allowed to walk on the main street. But the garage was on the side street, so we used to use the garage entrance and exit. And my grandfather, who was very fond of me, used to come and visit through the garage door, and it was very close to the main street, and my mother used to beg him, don't come to the house, they can catch you and they can cut your beard. This much I remember. Or burn your beard, stay in your house and I will send her to your place. No, he used to insist that he would come and visit us, which was dangerous. So this much I now realize that I knew that it's dangerous for Jews to, especially Jews like my grandfather, who walk on the main street.
Were there any signs to indicate that this was a Jewish home on the outside?
No, because the landlord wasn't Jewish, the law office wasn't Jewish, except the other family of Dr. Kaufman and his wife and us. But of course we had to wear our yellow bands and the stars on our clothes.
At what point did you stop going to school? When did that?
Right away. The minute the Germans occupied the country and the war was over, the Jewish children were not allowed to attend school. So my mother and some other friends who had children my age hired a teacher, and we were taught at home, always in somebody else's home because it was against the law. But we did get lessons, and the Hebrew teacher would still come, the English teacher would still come, and we would get the lessons at home till we had to leave.
We're going to continue in just a moment.